Hey everybody, welcome back to the Consumer Warrior Podcast. The podcast is dedicated to helping you with your big debt problems. If you're just dabbling in debt, this isn't the podcast for you. We deal with the big debt problems like repossession, debt collection lawsuits, foreclosure, bankruptcy, and all those other horrible financial problems out there. We're here to help you to help yourself. Welcome back to the show. I'm your host, John Skiba. I'm a consumer protection attorney in the state of Arizona, and I'm also a certified Ramsey Solutions Master Financial Coach, where I help people with things like budgeting, getting out of debt, and moving forward better financially. So in today's episode, I'm going to talk about a topic that I've been thinking about for a while, and I've struggled with how to present this information and really to get these thoughts out and articulate something that I've been thinking about. And that topic is taking ownership of your debt problem. And, I've been doing this a long time. I meet with a lot of people. I calculated the other day, I was giving a talk at Financial Peace University. I'm a coordinator for that course, which is Dave Ramsey's course on how to get out of debt. And in preparation for that, I was calculating how many people I estimate that I've consulted with over their debt problems over the last 15 years of my law practice. And the number is far in excess of 10,000 families that I've sat with. And, of all those families, I've done thousands of bankruptcies. I've done, hundreds of trials with debt collection lawsuits. And so I feel like I kind of have a fair grasp on people's, how they deal with that, the perceptions, the stresses, and everything that goes along with it. But something that I've been thinking about recently, based upon a few experiences, is really how do people take ownership and taking ownership of your debt problem. And so I want to present this in a way that where I'm not trying to condemn anybody or criticize anybody, but I think that taking ownership of this mess that's been created, because I think that's the first step in it. You've got to acknowledge, except in the cases of like identity theft, that you have created a financial mess that needs to be dealt with. And taking ownership that, okay, I did this, and now what is it that I'm going to do to solve the problem? Now, there's a lot of different ways you can solve it. I mean, you can do financial coaching, which is what I do to help people to get out of debt. I also help people file for bankruptcy. That will deal with the debt problem. If you're getting sued by a debt collector or a junk debt buyer, as far as responding to it, litigating the case, settling it, whatever you're going to do, taking some sort of action in dealing with the problem. Because that's the number one thing I see what drives people into the most furthest problems when it comes to debt collection and being in financial crisis is just ignoring everything altogether. But when you take ownership of it, you, first of all, like I said, acknowledge that there is a mess that's been created. And I think you need to acknowledge that you made that mess. There may be a lot of other things surrounding it, particularly like with medical expenses, things that you didn't necessarily, aren't necessarily your fault, that you didn't plan on happening, and they just happened. But there's a mess there associated with something that you did, and then you need to deal with it. So I think that's the first thing, is just to acknowledge that mess is there and it's got to be cleaned up. Second is to understand that you're making a decision, you're taking action to fix the overall problem. Again, whether it's through coaching, bankruptcy, debt settlement, whatever it is that you're doing to solve the problem. But what I see sometimes is I see people who get so caught up in the process of eliminating the debt, and their focus tends to be on that process, whether it's the legal process in dealing with a debt collection lawsuit, whether it's the legal process in dealing with the bankruptcy court or with a trustee that's been assigned to your bankruptcy case, or the debt settlement process. There's so much focus on that process that people tend to lose sight sometimes of step number one, which is that you're the one that made this mess, that the debt is there, you incurred the debt. And like I said, with the exceptions of identity theft, you've got to deal with it. And people when they focus on the process so much, they lose sight of the fact that they're the ones that started this problem in the first place. Now, this isn't to excuse any kind of abuse by debt collectors or debt collectors that violate the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. Those things are completely unacceptable. It also doesn't excuse junk debt buyers like Midland Funding, portfolio recovery, and that going to court with a bunch of garbage evidence. I'm not saying that people shouldn't defend themselves. I'm not saying that if a debt collector decides to sue you in court that they should be put on notice that they're going to have to prove up that debt. It's one thing to say that you owe a debt. It's a whole nother thing to take something to court. If the debt collectors want to do that or the junk debt buyers want to do that, then the burden's on them to prove their case, and they've got to step up and do that. But what I'm saying is, if let's say you have an American Express card and they sue you, and you're in the court process, and you're fighting, you're battling, you're doing everything you can to try to limit your overall exposure here. If a court was to grant judgment in the end, sometimes I see people who will treat that as essentially they become a victim of that process. When assuming that everything was on the up and up in the legal process, that's not the case. It's not fun to lose those things. It's not fun to have judgments. I fully understand that. But we have to kind of go back to the very beginning where you did use the card. You had to pay for services. In saying this, and this is hard for someone who's pro-consumer, I'm on absolutely my client's side. I'm just saying I think that it's always important to remember where this debt came from, where it incurred, why it is that we're dealing with these, opposing attorneys, we're dealing with U.S. trustees, we're dealing with debt collectors, everything else, and how not fun that whole process is. We've got to remember, why we're here in the first place. And why we're here is because there was a debt issue that went unresolved. That you didn't take care of it, and so now there's a lot more complications. And I fully understand. In fact, I make a living focusing on that process and making sure that process is done correctly. But to remember that, if you're in a bankruptcy case and a bankruptcy trustee legitimately finds an asset that needs to be liquidated for the benefit of your creditors, that process is not fun. But at the end of the day, you're still getting a pretty smoking deal because you're generally getting rid of a lot more debt than you are, for the value of that asset. For instance, say you had like a motorcycle or something that's going to be liquidated for $5,000. That process is not fun. But if I were to come to you years before and say, hey, if you sell that motorcycle, I'll get rid of all your debt, you'd take that in a heartbeat because it's a pretty good deal. So my purpose in this episode is really just to say, try to keep, the big picture in mind as you're going through this process. I know that this is a stressful time in dealing, particularly when you're dealing with the difficult legal processes, repossession, lawsuits, foreclosure, bankruptcy, all those things that, we talk about here on the show. I understand that these are heart-wrenching, stressful time. I'm just saying, try to keep some perspective about it. Don't focus so much on the process that you almost start forgetting or tricking yourself into thinking that somehow this is the credit card company's problem. There was a debt that was incurred, and this is all assuming that everything's on the up and up and that they are doing the things that they're supposed to and they're treating you fairly. But at the end of the day, there were charges made on a card. There were bills that weren't paid, and that's why we're here. And so there's different things that can be done through the process to limit the exposure that you have and to limit the liability. And I think those are legitimate, and I think that those are appropriate ways to deal with the underlying problem. I think it's just helpful to not forget that big picture, because as you do this, here's kind of the point. I'll wrap it up on this. As you do this, as you keep that big picture in mind, I think it changes behavior in moving forward. I think it changes the way you deal with money. I think it'll change the way you deal with credit and debt and all that moving forward. Whereas if you come through that process feeling that I was essentially the victim in it, I think that that's where you run the risk of not, the mindset hasn't been changed, and you're in a situation where you're open to these things happening again. And I see that. Unfortunately, I see that where, Chapter 7 cases can only be filed once every 8 years. And I've had clients that have filed multiple Chapter 7 cases just because, they file one and then the behavior hasn't changed. The immediate problem has been fixed through the bankruptcy, but the overall behavior and mindset hasn't changed. And that has resulted in additional debt and a second bankruptcy 8 years later. And you want to avoid that. So, and that, that's why I really got into the coaching as well. I've always been kind of skeptical of the whole coaching scene, but it's one of these things where I've seen a need in doing this for a decade and a half now. I just see a need where people the law is really great at solving some immediate pain, like stopping foreclosure, stopping garnishment. It's really good at that. It's not that great at just solving the overall problem and helping you not only avoid debt in the future, but getting wealth, putting savings aside, and really being financially sound. So that's why I do the coaching as well, which I know a lot of people, when they hear that I do financial coaching, particularly with under the Dave Ramsey approach, and then they also hear I'm a bankruptcy attorney, I get that look like, those things don't go together. And I think they can go together. And I think that, we can solve immediate problems, but also change overall approach to money and behavior surrounding money going forward. So take ownership. That's the theme of today's podcast. Take ownership of the debt problem, get it solved, and then let's take the steps necessary to avoid the problem going forward. So that's going to do it for this episode of the podcast. Appreciate you checking in. If you want to learn more about my services as a coach, which I can do nationwide, or if you want to learn more about some of our tutorials that we have online, templates, forms, we have some free downloads, head on over to legal.coach. That's the actual website, www.legal.coach. Or you can find out about my financial coaching practice at debtfree.coach. So legal.coach and debtfree.coach. We'd be happy to see how we could help you out. With that being said, we'll catch you next time.